All right. What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, aka Mr. Delks Moses, aka Mr. Anoints himself with grease, governed by caprice. Shout out to my guy Kamal in the chat. Pound to you, Kamal, and pound to everybody else out there who's going to tune in to this Real Trill live stream. Today is April 2nd, 2025, and we are continuing our reading of Neil MacMaster's Racism in Europe, a powerful book that came out in 2001 by a white man. A white man wrote this book. An East Anglian professor, a white man wrote this book. There are some good white people out there. There are some good white people out there who can actually call out the BS amongst their community. And that's what we are looking at today. We're going to continue reading this book. We're in the middle of chapter 1 right here. And we're only going to be reading a few sections. I'll only be on live for maybe like 45 to 50 minutes because I got more work to do, more writing to do for Culturalist Theory. Go subscribe to that channel where I do the writing for that. Go subscribe to Backpack Bandits where my wife and I are dropping a bunch of travel content. And of course, subscribe to this trill-ass channel. Now this book here, Racism in Europe, you can find on Amazon. If I'm able to click it, Jesus Christ, nothing is working with me today. Everything has just been a total mess, total mess. You can find this book on Amazon for the humble price of only $22.52 and $66 hardcover. And like I said, we're only going to be reading a few sections. We're going to try to cover as much as we can. The previous live streams, the 3 other ones we've done, have been fantastic. So I highly encourage you to check out them before you tune into this one as well. But let's get into it. We're going to start here with race, eugenics, and motherhood, 1870 to 1914. So, by the 1880s, there was growing concern that a decline in birth rates and high infant mortality was undermining the demographic potential of the nation. More babies were required to provide future workers, soldiers, and an imperial race to fill the empty spaces of existing or future colonies. White populations were required not only to man the empire and control the natives, but also to prevent rival master races from investing and annexing colonial territories. Increasing attention was turned towards motherhood, and propaganda and educational campaigns targeted women as those with the prime responsibility for rearing of the imperial race. Since the birth and rearing of healthy children was a matter of major concern to the state, the responsibility for child rearing was no longer an individual or private affair, but a matter of national duty. The state assumed ever-increasing powers to intervene within the private sphere of the family and to maximize reproductive powers through a range of interventions, from compulsory schooling, provision of school meals and milk, family allowances, and maternity leave, to restrictions on female and child labor, training of midwives, and food hygiene legislation. This was all tied into a powerful ideology of motherhood that continuously emphasized women's sacred maternal duty and the need to avoid birth control and race suicide. Young women needed to be taught how to choose a suitable father figure, or suitable future father, and trained in the skills required to raise the eugenically conceived child, the correct forms of baby nutrition, of cleanliness, and sanitation. Through such instruction, it was noted in 1903, women would be preserved for their supreme function, the procreation and preservation of the race. So this is very interesting stuff right here. It echoes a lot of what we're seeing right now, how the battle over women's bodily autonomy is still raging across much of the Western developed world. But I gotta say this, I never thought of mandatory schooling, giving kids school lunches, or teaching people how to have proper hygiene as a type of birth control to some degree. And if not birth control, it's like a something used to spur on people to have children. Many of the social policies that were implemented towards the end of the 19th century were not really to make people's lives better. It was to make the working class continue to reproduce themselves. And in the mind of the European, the racialized European, who was racializing himself and others, to create a class of people that they deemed to be of the right eugenic genetic stock, if that makes sense. Let's continue here. The eugenic emphasis on the duties of the mother was frequently linked to a conservative attack on the new woman, who was pushing for greater rights, the franchise, and was deserting her natural maternal function for educational advancement and professional training. Typically, the books and manuals on mothercraft and childcare assumed that all babies were male, and preferably virile, the future soldiers and colonizer of the Imperium. As the eugenic doctor and expert on childcare, Caleb Celebi, wrote on his Parenthood and Race Culture, 1909, the history of nations is determined not on the battlefield, but in the nursery. And the battalions which give lasting victory are the battalions of babies. The politics of the future will be domestics. For Elizabeth Slawchesser, author of Perfect Health for Women and Children, 1912, home was the cradle of the race, empire's first line of defense. In France, millions of pro-natalist postcards were printed showing babies sitting on the barrels of field guns. These were described as the seeds of future poilus or Tommies. Race, sport, and national fitness. The final aspect of white referential racism we shall consider, the techniques through which Europeans worked upon their own racial substance, concerns the spread of movements for the perfection of national physique through athletics, gymnastics, and drill. From 1880 onwards, the concern over racial degeneration, national efficiency, and military and imperial weakness began to find a solution in physical training and mass sports. England provides the best-known example of the trend, through the ethos of muscular Christianity and the development of new team sports, particularly football, rugby, and rowing, among the elite youth in the public schools and at Oxbridge. However, although each nation tended to have its own specific sporting culture, as with, for example, the nationalistic functions of skiing in Sweden or French cycling in the Tour de France, the underlying links between physical fitness, competitiveness, and national efficiency were quite universal. Through team sport, youth learned the arts of obedience and command, withstood pain with stoicism, trained the will, and most crucially, developed an esprit de corps and heroic sacrifice on behalf of the school or nation. The heroic language of war, as well as of imperial conquest, was that of the playing field. Doctors played a key role in the national and international associations for football, swimming, cycling, rowing, athletics, gymnastics, and skiing that proliferated across Europe, while the theory and language of physical training was elaborated as a eugenic and social Darwinist discourse. The links between physical fitness and militarism were most explicit in the gymnastic and rifle clubs of France, Belgium, Germany, the Turnen, and Bohemia, the Sokol, Denmark, and Russia. Physical training and drill became a compulsory element in state schools, while youth movements from the Boy Scouts to the Wandervogel placed an emphasis on fitness, parading, and nationalism. Now, this sort of echoes how we think about sports in America. Like, for example, American football, we call them gladiators on the field, and we, have hero worship of the icons in sports and stuff like that. And also sports is a big part of the American high school experience, right? We have the stereotypes about the jocks, being the popular kids in school, and, that push to put kids into sports as well. But I don't think it's as a part of the system in America as sports is in other countries. For example, when I first went to Turkey, in my wife's home city of Marmaris, one of the holidays was the National Day of Sports and Youth. The National Day of Sports and Youth, where they encourage young people to go out and do sports and exercise and all that. And generally, that's a good thing, I would say. Generally, we should encourage kids. But what was the intention behind it? It was about nation building. It was about the underlying fascism that underlies the whole process of making the nation state. Having people follow commands. Having people be stoic in the face of pain. Having people play their heart out for something that's greater than them, that's ultimately meaningless. Just like the nation state. You're willing to die for a country the same way you're willing to root and cheer or cry if your favorite football team loses. All of these things have a lot of similarities, I would say. Continuing here. The enormous expansion in international mass spectator sports, exemplified by the revived Olympic movement, was accompanied by a growing feeling that success or failure in competition was a mark of the biological fitness of the race nation. Major sporting events like the international gymnastic competitions provided arenas for the parading of national symbols, flags, uniforms, patriotic songs, synchronized in military-style movements, and splendid muscled bodies. The growing cult of the body, and in particular that of the super male, diffused through newspaper photographs and film of famous athletes, established idealized aesthetic criteria for the perfect racial type, in contrast to the degenerate or neurasthenic type, debilitated and pathologically weakened by urban life. The sportsman's muscular physique exemplified not only physical fitness, but inner moral race characteristics: energy, will, stamina, and purity. In Sweden, for example, skiing as the national sport carried deep cultural and symbolic meanings of manliness connected to hunting and war, of heroism linked to great polar expeditions, and of virtue, the image of snow, purity, and the wilderness. Such connection between ideal white bodies and sport was later to receive its most famous representation in Leni Riefenstahl's film of the 1936 Berlin Olympics, in which the Greek aesthetic, the perfect body type, was merged with that of the German area. Interesting. I know Sweden is one of those countries that has the highest amount of gym memberships in the world. Fascism. We call it fash. Fascist fashion. Anyway, I'm joking. Continuing here. The influence of social Darwinism and eugenics. The remaining part of this chapter examines the extent to which social Darwinism and eugenics spread geographically across Europe between 1870 and 1914, and how far they influenced a wider public and made an impact on political parties, government policy, and legislation. This provides a useful case study of the way in which scientific ideas percolated down into the wider society. In recent years, historians have undertaken a comparative study of social Darwinism to show how the application of evolutionary theory to an understanding of society varied considerably from one nation-state to another, according to differing pre-Darwinian traditions in biological science and the social and political context prevailing in each country. To date, we know most about Britain, France, and Germany, the three nations in which social Darwinism made the greatest impact before the First World War. But gradually, historians are extending their investigation to previously neglected states like Spain, Italy, Russia, and Sweden. It appears that social Darwinism, the general idea that contemporary society could be analyzed as a process of struggle for survival between competing groups or individuals, was omnipresent throughout European higher culture in the later 19th century. To take just one example, Thomas Glick has shown that by the 1870s, battles over Darwinism were raging even in the backwaters of that most provincial of nations, Spain. Spain shade. Throwing shade on Spain. They need it. It's hot down there. Sun's always blazing. Even in the distant Canary Islands, controversy had filtered down to parish level, while a Valladolid secondary school teacher, Luis Perez Minguez, in an 1880 critique of On the Origin of Species, remarked that there was throughout Europe so dense an atmosphere of Darwinism that one can scarcely inhale anything else. In the period from circa 1900 onwards, a dense network of eugenic scholarship spread across Europe. Highly influential teams of scientists working on the statistics of hereditary and biometrics, Mendelian genetics, physical anthropology, psychiatry, public health, epidemiology, artificial insemination, and serology were in constant communication through a network of correspondence. What is serology? I gotta look that up. I don't know what that means. We're always gonna look up the words. Nothing, no shame in my game, but I need somebody to be my permanent definition man or definition lady, because hey, anybody could do it. Let's put that in the chat. What is serology? What is that? Serology. Put the word here. Okay. It says here, serology is a noun. It is the scientific study of diagnostic examination of blood serum, especially with regard to the response of the immune system to pathogens or introduced substances. Interesting. Okay. So, So basically, all of these things were in constant communication through a network of correspondence, the exchange of learned papers and colloquia. So people were talking about these new advances in science or understanding of the natural world through the lens of social Darwinism, right? Or through Darwinism in general, but then extrapolated it to society. Thus, social Darwinism was born. The first International Eugenics Congress in London, 1912, was attended by delegates from Britain, France, Switzerland, Germany, Italy, Belgium, Spain, Greece, and Denmark. Eugenics studies were also well advanced in Austria, Sweden, Norway, Romania, Serbia, Russia, Poland, Hungary, Holland, Portugal, and Czechoslovakia. Yep, Hungary is not missing. Hungary ain't missing right here. They were practicing eugenics in Hungary. In many of these states, scientists were establishing eugenic laboratories of criminal anthropology. Italy, Bavaria, Portugal, Poland, and eugenics entered the university curriculum. Historians, among them Paul Wendeling, have argued that the growth in late 19th century society of a pervasive biological discourse or scientific language of race can be linked to the tremendous growth and influence of medical science. Right across Europe, there was a rapid expansion in the number of trained doctors of medicine and biologists, who became increasingly influential through their involvement in major areas of public policy and decision-making, from sanitation, public health, crime, and disease control, to the improvement of midwifery, childcare, and diet. Michel Foucault, in an influential thesis, argued that modern states from the 18th century onwards began to develop biopower, political technologies for the regulation of the life processes of entire human populations. The administration of life assumed two basic forms. Firstly, the disciplining and optimization of the capabilities of the individual body, especially through the control of sexuality, and secondly, the regulation of the species body, of biological processes, propagation, birth, level of health, life expectancy, and welfare. Biopower was indispensable to the development of capitalism and the modern state, the optimization of economy, armies, police forces, and colonial settlement. Strategies for the maximization of species power was an inherently racial project which was addressed to the body, to life, to what causes it to proliferate, to what reinforces the species, its stamina, its ability to dominate, or its capacity for being used. Foucault's analysis would suggest that racism was an integral component of modernity, of capitalism, and state power, and as such, it might be predicted that racism would develop across Europe hand in hand with industrialization, urbanization, and economic modernization. But this is interpretation at a very generalized level. What were the political and legislative impacts of eugenics at the level of the nation state? In order to answer this question, it is helpful to distinguish between two main currents within the eugenics movement. On the one hand, a highly conservative and implicitly racist type that emphasized negative eugenics, and on the other, a more progressive form that was supported by liberal humanists, socialists, and various brands of radicalism. Looking first at negative genetics, which lent itself to authoritarianism, this found its main ideological formation through the germplasm theory of August Weismann, born in 1834 and died in 1914. His germplasm theory was influential from the 1890s, and which was then reinforced by the rediscovery from 1900 of Mendel's theory. In general, both theories maintain that the hereditary component of germ, today we might say the genetic coding, could not be altered in any way by the environment. In the hands of eugenicists, who greatly exaggerated nature over nurture, this meant that inferior or degenerate types could not be improved or altered in any way by programs of reform, education, rehabilitation, or improved environment, housing, health, diet, etc. Even if there were minor improvements, these could not be genetically transmitted onwards to any offspring. Such a theory was highly conservative. It argued that reform programs were a waste of time and money, since no amount of education or welfare could change the immutable hereditary material that determined behavior. The germplasm theory tended to be adopted by those professional elites, particularly in Britain and Germany, who hoped to legitimate the status quo, the fixity of class, race and gender identities and inequalities at a time of unusually rapid social, political, and economic change. Going now to the comments, Garlic Jean says, hello, brother. Hello to Garlic Jeans. Remember, I am not your brother, I'm your comrade. I am a comrade with you. My name is Comrade Hill. Comrade Hill. I have one brother. And calling anybody else brother feels very disrespectful to him. I'm not your brother. I am your comrade in the fight against white supremacy. So shout out to Garlic Jeans. But continuing here. So, such eugenicists shared a paranoid fear of decline and regression, rather than an optimistic vision of a future utopia. Eugenic discourse was peppered with terms of moral condemnation towards the degenerate lower orders, terms that indicated the way in which the science of hereditary was largely a translation into scientific language of traditional conservative, religious, and class attitudes towards the understanding, corrupt, and immoral poor. The eugenicists' preoccupation with the sexual lives of the working class, their wish to eliminate hereditary prostitution, primitive and uncontrolled libidinal drives, and uncontrolled reproduction was closely related to bourgeois respectability, sexual repressions, and the wider concerns to moralize the poor. All right, Garlic Jeans says, understandable. Shout out to you, Garlic Jeans. But let us know what you think about the topic, because this is a class. This is a lesson where we are reading the text of a professor named Neil MacMaster, who wrote this book, Racism in Europe, that you can find on Amazon. And let me know what you think about this, Garlic Jeans. Why do you think some people still believe in the germ theory today? The idea that certain races, certain people cannot be improved. There are inherent characteristics in certain people. Let us know why some people think that way. Let us know what you think, Garlic Jeans, in relation to the text. This is a free classroom for everybody to learn and laugh together. This ain't some BS YouTube channel where I'm just some guy spouting out the side of his neck. We are here to educate ourselves. So let us know what you think, Garlic Jeans. Excited to hear your input on this wonderful text that we're reading together as a unified class. Let's continue here. So the eugenicists' preoccupation with the sexual lives of the working class, their wish to eliminate hereditary prostitution, primitive and uncontrolled libidinal drives, and uncontrolled reproduction was closely related to bourgeois respectability, sexual repression, and the wider concern to moralize the poor. Negative eugenics spread rapidly among large sectors of the European educated elites who, during the period of 1870 to 1914, began to desert liberalism for a conservative or modernizing authoritarianism. This can be seen, for example, in the growing support for Bismarckian state socialism among leading eugenicists like Ernest Haeckel. This anti-liberal trend was partly rooted in a disillusionment with an earlier phase of social reform that, it was thought, had failed to make any impact on criminality and other forms of degeneration. However, before the First World War, negative eugenics had a limited impact on the legislation of European states. Firstly, it can be noted that it took many decades for the eugenic movement to find an institutional base from which it could make an impact on national policies. Eugenic associations were only established in Germany in 1905, Britain in 1907 and 1908, and France in 1912. This delay is itself indicative of differences that divided and weakened the movement internally, and of the problems that eugenics faced in gaining wider public support. Before 1914, ideas or legislative proposals for premarital medical inspections, castration, or sterilization of criminals, or the feeble-minded, institutional segregation of degenerates, the enhancement of elite reproduction, and similar measures were generally met with opposition on the grounds that they represented a dangerous threat to civil liberties. A widespread criticism of such eugenics was that it was dehumanizing and reduced people to the level of animal breeding stock. That's a shame. That's truly a shame that, some people thought that. So why didn't they just ban them outright and say we don't want any eugenic societies at all? This is one thing that I'm annoyed with. People say we don't like eugenics, we don't like the racism, we don't like the anti-blackness, we don't like the anti-Semitism, yet and still they do nothing about it. They do nothing about it. And maybe I'm a bit hypocritical because everybody knows that right now in Hungary, the leader of Zionist Israel, Bibi genocidal Netanyahu, is out here in the city right now, eating up all the langosh and dipping it in goulash. Bibi Netanyahu is running around Budapest right now, and I'm not doing nothing. I'm not protesting. I'm not trying to give him a beeper. I'm not trying to do nothing. I'm not trying to do nothing to stop Bibi Netanyahu. So am I being hypocritical? Am I being hypocritical? I'm at least doing my part by saying, fuck Netanyahu. Fuck any of the Zionists, genocidal maniacs that support those people. And yeah, that man should be arrested for war crimes. How do you have a wanted criminal entering the country? I probably couldn't even enter Hungary if I was a wanted criminal in my own country. Continuing here. The political constraints that prevented the implementation of eugenic programs can be illustrated through the example of Winston Churchill, a keen advocate of the improved breeding of the British race. During his term as Home Secretary, 1910 to 1911, Churchill circulated eugenic reports to the cabinet, including a study by Dr. Treadgold, The Feeble-Minded, A Social Danger, which, in apocalyptic language, attributed national decline to the 100,000 criminals, paupers, and unemployables, prostitutes, and ne'er-do-wells, who were breeding at twice the national average. Churchill, who was influenced by the introduction of forcible sterilization of degenerates in the state of Indiana, drew up similar proposals in a paper intended for cabinet. He also advocated procedures that would have given the Home Office extraordinary powers to send mental defectives to forced labor camps, segregated under proper conditions, that their curse died with them. However, Churchill's views were extreme, even by the standards of the age, and his proposals met with strong opposition from Home Office officials, including one expert, Dr. Donkin, who argued for a more humane policy. Charles Masterman, a junior minister at the Home Office, told Churchill that such proposals were not politically acceptable given the climates of public opinion, while the Prime Minister Asquith refused to defend such ideas in public. However, Churchill, who was one of the vice presidents of the First International Eugenics Congress in 1912, I did not see, we learn more and more every day. This is why we read these books. There's something wrong with Churchill, and I always side-eye people that admire Churchill. I always give a side eye to people that admire Churchill. Now, I can also understand that some people don't know much about Churchill. They know much about Churchill as most people know about George Washington or the first Britney Spears album. Like, they know it exists or they know it existed, but that's it. And they generally think it's okay. Like, Churchill is one of those people who just always, the more you read about him, the more you realize this was a very bad dude. This man was the vice president of the Eugenics Congress in 1912. And we're not even talking about years later with the Bengal famine, when he made millions of Indian people die of starvation, and didn't care about it, laughed about it, chomped on his fat ass cigar. Fuck Churchill. Anyway, so Churchill did contribute to the campaign that culminated in the only piece of eugenics legislation to be passed into law in Britain, the Mental Deficiency Act of 1913. But noted one commentator in 1914, compulsory sterilization of the kind that existed in the United States was politically impossible, since public opinion in the country is not ripe for such drastic a proceeding. In other European states, the situation was similar. In France, the campaign for a premarital examination law, which was attacked as a measure that would endow doctors with unwarranted powers, went on for many decades, only to pass finally into law in 1914 under the Vichy regime. It is significant that the leading German eugenicist, Plotz, showed anti-Semitic, pan-German sentiments in his diaries and private correspondence, and was sympathetic to Henschel's published plan of 1904 for an Aryan racial utopia, Mitzgart, a breeding colony with 10 women for every eugenically selected male. That's wild. That's wild. That's a wild racist plan. It sounds like the beginning of a Tushy video. It sounds like a Tushy video. 10 Aryan women for one single man. But that's a wild idea. How would people even agree to that? How would people even agree to join such a sick colony? I don't know. Yet, in public, Plutz suppressed his racist views, recognizing that they would not be acceptable to opinion, and even attacked Henschel for applying the practice of cattle breeding to humans. There was no eugenic legislation in Germany before 1914, and it was only after 1918 that a political climate arose that would enable sterilization and premarital examination laws to be passed in Denmark, 1919, Norway, 1919, Germany, 1933, Sweden, 1935, and Switzerland. Kamal says, good to know, Simon. I virtually know nothing about Churchill beyond his quote, so this is educational. Shout out to Kamal. Yes, we're trying to educate people, man. We don't know much about Churchill, but the more we find out about this character, the least we like him. The less we like him. We like Churchill less and less. Continuing here. The second, more progressive current in European eugenics can be generally described as neo-Lamarckian. Lamarck's theory, insofar as it maintained that acquired characteristics could be inherited, lent itself readily to a more progressive environmentalism. A social reform could have an impact on both the living as well as on their future descent. Many eugenicists regarded themselves as on the political left and saw amelioration of the social and welfare conditions of the working class as a way of creating a future population which would grow increasingly perfect in physique and intelligence. You know, one of the most interesting film analyses I've ever watched was the analysis of the film Django and Leonardo DiCaprio's character. I forgot his name, but the slave master who has the mean face that we all know and basically who owns Stephen, who was played by Samuel L. Jackson, you know, the Uncle Tom's type slave, right? The film analysis positioned Leo's character in Django as the modern liberal leftist who believes in science, who imagines himself to be more enlightened, who avoids some of the norms of society against certain groups of people who are marginalized, and can talk to people face to face and make them feel like they're human, while at the same time believing the most regressive, conservative, reactionary things. If you remember at the end of Django, Leo's character is about to kill Django, and he bashes open his skull and says, at the back of this skull there are 3 dots, just like you, Django. So even though you're an exceptional Negro, you are still a Negro. You get what I'm saying? Thank you. Kamal says Calvin Candy. Yes, Calvin Candy. If you remember at the end of Django, Calvin Candy told Django, you have the 3 dots in the back of your skull, just like any other of my slaves. So even though you're an exceptional Negro, even though he didn't say Negro, you are still a Negro, right? So it's very interesting that the eugenicists of their time, basically what we would call white supremacists, who were planning on having these blue-eyed, blonde-haired women trapped in a farm while one Aryan man fucks on all of them, who were planning these crazy breeding fantasies, you know what I'm saying? The people that were planning all these wild eugenic experiments and stuff for the white race, who we would now say are white supremacists, considered themselves leftists at the time, which makes us always have to remember that we have to be revolutionary in our thinking, not just liberal in our thinking. We have to have a radical imagination and a radical type of, how can I say this? Not speculation, but questioning. We have to have a radical, revolutionary questioning to all the information that we're given. Even challenge ourselves in our beliefs. Kamal says Candyland. Kamal says Candyland. Yes, Candyland was the name of the slave plantation where Calvin Candy owned all the slaves. And he considered himself a progressive, a liberal, and stuff like that, even though he owned slaves. It's crazy how humans can be so complex. Calvin Candy also was not racist, though, because he had sex with black women. Let's all remember that, too. All right, continuing here. So, many eugenicists regarded themselves as on the political left and saw amelioration of the social and welfare conditions of the working class as a way of creating a future population which would grow increasingly perfect in physique and intelligence. Theories of social Darwinism and a more negative eugenics made little impact in France before the 1920s, and this has been ascribed to the entrenched position of Lamarckian theory. In no European state was there a deeper level of anxiety about degeneration degeneration and demographic decline than in France, a pessimism that arose from a birth rate which was much lower than that of its competitors, especially Germany. Perhaps in no society were feelings of national degeneration as entrenched as in France. Yet, in a contradictory way, this did not lead to a powerful current of negative eugenics. The reason was simple enough. It was politically untenable to promote an elitist vision of selection, the elimination of the unfit, when France desperately needed to foster and protect its total population. This created a climate in which radical eugenicists and racist ideologues like George Vacher de la Poge and Charles Richet remained marginal figures. The enormous loss of French life in the First World War further reinforced the emphasis on quantity over quality. So, as we see, the beginning of the nation state shows people really starting to put a lot of emphasis on the amount of people that they have within their nation. Russian eugenics followed a rather similar development to that of France. During the pre-revolutionary era, social Darwinism had made a big impact in Russia. In 1866, V.M. Florensky published The Improvement and Degeneration of the Human Race, and Galton's Hereditary Genius was translated into Russian in 1875. During the period of 1900 to 1914, numerous works appeared on evolution and the hereditary aspects of alcoholism, crime, and psychopathology, while I.A. Filipchenko taught the first genetics course at St. Petersburg University from 1913 onwards. Going to the comments, Kamal says, I was amazed that folks went online asking if that scene was scientifically true. That's crazy that people actually, you know what, Kamal, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised because, unfortunately, there are still people today. There are a lot of people today that believe because of their skin color, there is a natural characteristic to them, or because of somebody else's skin color or nationality, there is a natural characteristic to them. And some people even extend that to a person's biology. So I'm not surprised. I am not surprised. Continuing here. So, however, the full implications of a socialist eugenics was only to develop after the Russian Revolution. A specifically Soviet or Bolshevik eugenics developed from 1920, which attacked negative eugenics, particularly American sterilization programs, as bourgeoisie forms of dehumanization. For Marxist biologists, the concept of an immutable germplasm was unacceptable, since it was difficult to reconcile with revolutionary and visionary principles of progress through scientific control of the environment. Soviet science thus tended towards various forms of positive eugenics, which would improve the quality of the entire population. The rejection of negative and selective eugenics was, as in the case of France, linked to the demographic crisis that marked the First World War and its aftermath. War and famine led to a truly catastrophic collapse in population and in St. Petersburg. For example, births exceeded deaths by 37 per 10,000 in 1910, while in 1920, deaths exceeded births by 484 per 10,000. Finally, there remains the question of how far social Darwinism and eugenics filtered down to affect popular attitudes and culture. The evidence here is patchy and difficult to interpret. Many leading eugenicists were avid publicists. For example, the racial anthropologist Otto Ehrmann went on extensive speaking tours, as did Ernst Haeckel and Karl Pearson. Propagandists lectured to ethical, debating, and philosophical societies, to working men's associations, school and university students, women's clubs, and medical and nursing associations. Leading exponents, fired with an almost religious sense of the scientist vocation, were also keen to publish their idea in a non-technical language and in a cheap popular format. The French eugenicist Edouard Toulouse, for example, reached a broader public through a series of how-to texts that were published by Hachette between 1908 and 1914. The eugenic message was also widely diffused through popular plays like The Damaged Goods by Brew or Covier's La Graine. Pearson wrote to Galton in 1907, overjoyed at the spread of eugenics into popular culture. I hear most respectable middle-class matrons saying if children are weak, that was not a eugenic marriage. By the way, we have to remind ourselves right here, when they're speaking about eugenics, of course they're talking about not reproducing with the inferior races, right? Like, of course, having a child with a black person or a Asian person or whatever other racialized group they can think of is going to be bad for the gene pool of whatever gene pool these eugenicists are trying to cultivate to be better, right? But this is also about stigmatizing the poor. This is also about stigmatizing people that are disabled. This is also about stigmatizing certain types of people with certain types of characteristics, even within the race. If somebody drinks too much alcohol, or if somebody consumes too much tobacco, or they like to have devious premarital sex, whatever it may be, this is about stigmatizing and targeting a specific type of person more than it is, well, just as much as it is about race, if that makes sense. So, Kamal says facts. It was that concept on which several of the interracial dating prospects failed. Okay. I'm sorry, Kamal, that happened to you, man. But keep on trying to pog. Pog, 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 pog. Keep on pogging, baby. Keep on pogging. Don't you ever stop pogging. Pog to your last breath. 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 Snow bunnies forever. Black queens never. Don't clip that. Don't clip that. Snow bunnies forever. Black queens never. Pog to your last breath. I'm joking. I'm joking. Anyway, I'm continuing here. Anyway, Pearson wrote, say if the children are weak, that was not a eugenic marriage. So, in 1910, the German Racial Hygiene Society organized a stand on eugenics at the International Hygiene Exhibition, which was visited by over 5 million people. The industrialist Frederick Krupp gave massive funding for the popularization of social Darwinism, and in 1899 offered a famous essay prize on the topic. What can we learn from the principle of evolution for the development and laws of the state, which received 60 entries from Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Russia, and the USA. The culture of the European middle classes was permeated with evolutionary and Darwinian language, and the basic concept of the survival of the fittest was passed on to millions of university students and school pupils. However, it seemed highly unlikely that the general public, including many of those who were well educated, either read or understood the complexities of Darwinian theory or, even less so, the new Mendelian genetics. It seems likely that popular notions of hereditary evolution and race were drawn from a much older discourse of animal breeding. This pre-scientific form of understanding is of considerable importance, since it has continued to influence popular forms of racism right down to the present day. The works of European eugenicists were saturated with ideas and analogies drawn from the world of the stock breeder, since breeders of horse, cattle, sheep, pigs, and dogs were able, through careful selection and the keeping of elaborate stock books, to mold and shape animals into a desired form. It was widely assumed that the same could be done with human beings. Darwin, in The Variation of Plants and Animals Under Domestication, 1868, assumed that the ideas and practices of animal breeders could have a scientific status. The papers given at the First International Eugenics Conference in 1912 made endless reference to the field of animal breeding, and the American Charles Davenport, one of the delegates, looked forward to a revolution when human matings could be placed on the same high plane as that of horse breeding. All Europeans during the period 1870 to 1914, whether located in agrarian or urban societies, would have had almost daily contact with horses as transport animals, while horse racing, hunting, and riding fed into a common language which rich in the terminology of bloodstock and breeding. The systematization of animal breeding, the invention of the specialized thoroughbred horse for hunting, the rearing of birds and pedigree dogs with particular characteristics like loyalty, or even of national types, the British Bulldog, the Alsatian, the Pekingese, was introduced during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The language and metaphors of animal breeding, as Enrique de Cal has shown, provide the key to the way in which the scientific racist ideas of the educated elite were transmitted into popular culture. Going here to the comments, Kamal says, "I'm on it, comrade." That's hilarious. That's the first time someone's called me comrade. Shout out to Kamal. Shout out to my guy Kamal. Gang, 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 gang. Anyway. A common eugenicist rhetorical device was to point out that more care and money went into the breeding of horses than into the improvement of the human race. Common sense and popular forms of racism after 1900, in spite of the advances of Mendelian genetics, continued to view human heredity as a blending of blood and of parental characteristics. Unfortunately, many eugenicists continued to use the language of the stockyard into the 1920s and 1930s. Thus encouraging both a widespread popular belief in an impossible science, human characteristics could not yet be engineered through selection, as well as dehumanizing racist language that reduced minorities to the level of animals, breeding like rabbits, half-castes, mongrels. Thus popular language became increasingly infused, as did that of the educated elites, with medical, biological, and organists terms or metaphors that lent themselves to the spread of racist attitudes. The period from 1870 to 1914 was an age in which self-referential forms of racism achieved an unprecedented level of elaboration. Although earlier societies certainly had rules that controlled who should marry whom, and aristocratic royal lineages preserved their essential purity of blood, never before had any society invented such a range of techniques and scientific theory and practices to ensure biological fitness. The wider movements to improve national efficiency and the economic, military, and imperial strength of the race, such as public health, natalism, physical fitness, and urban hygiene, found acceptance across the political spectrum. Before the First World War, eugenics, in spite of its growing influence, made little impact on legislation. In general, the most negative forms of intervention, compulsory sterilization, premarital vetting, segregation of the degenerate, could make little impact as long as politicians and the general public viewed them as a dangerous threat to basic civil rights. See, I kind of disagree with that right there. You know, eugenics was very influential in the U.S., I would say. And if you're going to say, you know, sterilization and, you know, segregation of the degenerates, meaning picking and choosing which people can marry, I find that to be very intrusive and very problematic in, you know, creating a civil society. Anyway, many Europeans share the sentiments of the American I.P. Whitehead that under eugenic statutes, a reign of doctors will be inaugurated and in the name of science, the worst forms of tyranny practiced. However, the widespread diffusion of social Darwinist concepts of a eugenic language of fitness at all levels of society did reinforce racist assumptions that the highest form of the human species was the white European. Social Darwinism also lent itself to an age of mounting nationalist tension and insecurity. Contemporaries certainly used the terms race and nation as interchangeable, and the nation was viewed, quite literally, as a distinct biological group, Nordic, Aryan, Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, Alpine, or Mediterranean types, one that carried essential characteristics in the germ plasm or blood. As Vacher de la Puig noted, nations are as real as races. They are biological entities. Oh, that's the worst. Oh, that's the worst. That's the worst take ever. Unfortunately, some people still believe that. Nations are as real as races. They are biological entities. No, they are not. All right. In the later half of the 19th century, much of the language of the degeneration had been centered on the dangerous and threatening lower orders, the savage and the animalistic race within of the common people. But after 1900, there was a shift towards social imperialism and similar forms of welfare nationalism that began to emphasize the racial unity of all social classes. The language of class as race appears to have subsided as new forms of corporatism, solidarism, or organic unity moved to the forefront. The emphasis was on cooperation between classes rather than competition and conflict. The efficient working together of all for the greater cohesion and strength of the nation locked in struggle with other states. Nor was such a vision of nationalism confined to conservatives worried by the growth of socialism and concepts of revolutionary class war. Numerous eugenicists regarded themselves as socialists, from Alfred Platz, who supported the German SPD, to Carl Pearson or Fabians like H.G. Wells, the Webbs, and Bernard Shaw. From the turn of the century, a peculiar form of socialism began to appear that rejected Marxist ideas of class struggle as dysgenic and emphasized the technocratic and biological engineering of the unified race nation. Right across Europe after 1870 and affecting all shades of political opinion, we can see signs of a deep shift towards authoritarianism forms of nationalism. The rising medical profession, through its claim that biological science was above politics, assisted this evolution. Increasingly, doctors laid claim to determine social policy according to the iron laws of natural science, laws that were deterministic and beyond any moral values or system of ethics. And in doing so, they threatened liberalism and the rights of the individual. The demands of nature, it was claimed, were paramount, and the selfish interest of the individual should, if necessary, be sacrificed to the greater good of the race and the quality of its hereditary substance or gene pool. Eugenicists began to argue that forcible sterilization was quite acceptable since the state already held power over life. The right to inflict capital punishment or to order soldiers to sacrifice their lives for the higher good of the community and national survival. Vacher de la Puge commented, "The individual is crushed by his race, he is nothing. The race, the nation are everything." The intrusion of dehumanizing forms of racism into medicine and public welfare was exemplified in Germany by the growing use of the concept of minderwertig, or lesser value. However, as will be discussed in part 2, it was the seismic shock of the First World War that was to produce the conditions under which such ideas could find a more receptive political environment in rising fascist and right-wing nationalistic movements. All right, so we're going to wrap it up here, everybody. We're going to start on part 2, one of the most interesting parts of the book, as I can tell by looking at the title, Blacks Without Blackness. Blacks Without Blackness. We can't be racist in Hungary. We do not have any black people, nigga. Now go away. So, yeah, exactly. So we're going to be looking at this chapter next time, Blacks Without Blackness, part 2. We'll read a few sections. I got to get ready for work, guys. We've been on live for about 50 minutes or so, 45 minutes or so. But very interesting book. I'm really enjoying it. I've been waiting to read this book for a while since I picked it up last year. And I got a lot of other books that I'm planning on reading on live and also in my personal life and doing some reviews for y'all. We got the Uncle Tom's Cabin review coming soon when I finish up that book. Probably do some reading tonight. And yeah, we'll chop it up with y'all tomorrow. Y'all be easy. Shout out to my guy Kamal. Shout out to my guy Garlic Jeans. And that's it. Y'all be easy out there. Peace.